Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving deep into a story from World War II that sounds, well, absolutely bonkers. Imagine this. A dead body, a completely fabricated identity, and a briefcase full of meticulously crafted lies. And this wasn't just some spy thriller plot. It was a real, high-stakes deception operation designed to, fundamentally trick the enemy during a critical phase of the war.
It really is the kind of plan where if you pitched it in a movie script, the studio might tell you it's just too unrealistic. But it happened. The Allies were gearing up for a major invasion in the Mediterranean, and getting the Germans to believe they were going somewhere else entirely was paramount.
Right, because getting that invasion wrong, landing where the enemy was fully expecting you, that meant massive casualties, lost ships, potentially delaying the end of the war. So they came up with this. Our mission in this deep dive is to trace how Operation Mincemeat went from a dark, sort of theoretical idea to a fully realized, incredibly risky masterpiece of deception. How did they find the body? How did they create a whole life for him? And how on earth did they make sure the Germans actually fell for it?
Well, what's fascinating here is that the initial spark for using a corpse for deception wasn't unique to mincemeat. It actually goes back surprisingly early, to a 1939 memo sometimes linked to Ian Fleming. He was in naval intelligence at the time.
The James Bond guy. Seriously. He was thinking up dead body schemes.
Apparently so.
Uh,
This Trout memo, as it was called, listed all sorts of wild deception ideas, and number 28 was titled A Suggestion, not a very nice one. And it was the basic concept, using a corpse to deliver misleading documents.
It feels incredibly grim, but also, I guess, pragmatic in a terrible way. Had they ever tried anything like this before, even accidentally?
There were hints. They'd used dummy bodies in North Africa with fake maps for minor deceptions, nothing on this scale. But the crucial bit of confirmation, really, came from a tragedy. In 1942, a British courier plane crashed off the coast of Spain.
Oh, no.
Yeah, a courier named James Haddon Turner. His body washed ashore with actual secret documents still on him.
So real secrets ended up potentially in enemy hands. That's bad.
Well, here's the thing. When the Spanish authorities returned the documents to the British, they hadn't been opened. But other intelligence confirmed the Germans had managed to copy something from a French agent on the same plane. So what this showed the British, definitively, was that Spanish authorities, while supposedly neutral, were indeed passing useful information found on bodies or downed personnel to the Germans.
Okay, that's a key insight then. They learned that documents found on bodies would likely make their way to German intelligence via Spain. So the idea is there, simmering, and they know the delivery method can work. Who actually takes this morbid concept and turns it into a full-blown plan?
That really fell to two remarkable individuals, Charles Cholmondeley, an RAF officer, and Ewan Montague, a naval intelligence officer and a lawyer in civilian life. They were part of this highly secretive, very clever unit within British intelligence.
The 20 Committee, right? The XX Committee for Double Cross, which is just perfect branding, isn't it?
Absolutely perfect. Cholmondeley had an early version, like Trojan Horse, but it was, well, a bit too complex. Montague was brought in, and together they refined it into the plan that became Operation Mincemeat.
Which brings us to the absolute heart of a plan, the really difficult bit, the body. How do you even begin to source a corpse for something like this? You can't just, put out an ad. It feels like the biggest hurdle.
It was definitely the most sensitive and ethically complex part. They needed a body that wouldn't show signs of, say, a violent death that wasn't drowning, and crucially had no family who would come looking or claim it. This is where they connected with the coroner in London, a man named Bentley Purchase.
And this is where Glyndwr Michael enters the story.
Yes. Glyndwr Michael was a homeless man who had sadly died in London. The coroner, Bentley Purchase, and the very renowned pathologist, Sir Bernard Spilsbury, they examined the case. Michael's death was due to ingesting rat poison containing phosphorus, and Spilsbury advised that this specific cause of death would be very difficult to detect after the body had been in salt water for days, especially with only a cursory examination, which was likely what they'd get in Spain. Purchase also confirmed Michael had no known relatives, making him the tragically suitable candidate.
It's almost impossible to comprehend the sort of administrative and ethical tightrope they must have walked to get access to this man's body while staying just within some semblance of legal bounds.
It was an incredibly fine line. They had to keep the body preserved, storing it in a cold room at about 4 degrees Celsius, cold enough to prevent decomposition, but not frozen solid. Because, frozen tissue would have been a dead giveaway during any examination. They were told they had a limited time window, maybe about 3 months, to use the body.
Right, the clock is ticking. So they have the body, Now they have to transform Glentor Michael into Major William Martin. This isn't just about putting a uniform on a corpse, is it? They built an entire life.
Exactly. That was key. They needed to create a persona so convincing, so full of seemingly mundane human detail, that any competent intelligence service examining his belongings would conclude this was absolutely a real person, genuinely lost at sea.
And that's where the wallet litter comes in. This amazing collection of everyday stuff.
Oh, the wallet litter was absolutely critical to making him seem real. They chose the name William Martin because it was common, very common. And the rank of acting major in the Royal Marines, also common enough. And it meant any routine inquiries would go straight to the Admiralty where Montague could intercept them.
Clever. And the personal items.
Yeah,
They're just so specific. It's incredible.
they are. A photograph of his invented fiancée, Pam. She was actually an MI5 clerk named Jean Leslie, love letters from Pam. A receipt for an engagement ring he'd supposedly just bought for 53 dens, 6 pence, a substantial amount then, implying, seriousness in the future. Then there were overdraft demands from his bank for 70 Moundiers, 19 Steckens, showing he had normal person's financial troubles, maybe a bit of a spendthrift even.
Little human flaws.
Exactly. Theater ticket stubs, club bills, keys, stamps.
It's like they were writing a biography through receipts and letters. Why go to this level of detail? Why not just fake some official orders?
Because intelligence officers are trained to look for the ground truth, the inconsistencies. Official documents can be faked, relatively easily sometimes, but a collection of everyday items that tell a consistent, if slightly messy personal story, that's much harder to fabricate convincingly. These details added depth, made him relatable, and built a plausible recent history in London. It's about creating a pattern of life that feels, well, authentic.
That's a really key insight into deception tradecraft, isn't it? It's the small, human touches that sell the big lie.
What about the photos? They couldn't exactly use the body for an ID card.
No, absolutely not. They had to find someone who physically resembled Glendur Michael, turned out to be a Captain Ronnie Reed of MI5, to pose in uniform for the ID photo. Looked just enough like him, apparently.
And even the uniform itself had a bit of a backstory, right? It wasn't just pulled off a rack.
Right. Cholmondeley, who was a similar build, actually wore it around for a bit to make it look naturally worn, not brand new.
Mm-hmm.
And they used high-quality woolen underwear, which was scarce due to rationing, lending another subtle touch of realism. I remember reading somewhere the underwear actually belonged to a deceased Oxford warden, or something equally specific and slightly morbid. Those kinds of weird, specific details really highlight the lengths they went to.
They really do. Okay, body prepared, legend created with incredible detail. Now, for the actual documents that carried the crucial lie, the payload, so to speak. Right. The goal here was to divert German attention away from Sicily, which was the actual invasion target, and make them think the Allies were going for Greece and maybe Sardinia instead. This was all part of a larger Allied deception strategy called Operation Barclay.
And the centerpiece document was this letter between very senior generals, not just some mid-level memo.
Precisely, a personal letter from Lieutenant General Archibald Nye, who was the Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff, a very senior role, a man whose job meant he genuinely knew Allied plans, addressed to General Harold Alexander, the Allied commander in North Africa.
Why a personal letter? Wouldn't an official order carry more weight, seem more official?
Well, a personal letter felt more natural, perhaps less likely to be sent through the most secure channels, like ciphered signals or locked diplomatic bags. It could credibly be carried by an officer traveling separately, like Major Martin. Nye wrote it himself, apparently, adding mundane details. Things like complaining about Americans awarding Purple Hearts to British troops, or discussing trivial appointments. This sort of background noise, this normalcy, made the crucial paragraph seem like genuine operational details slipped into a private update between peers.
That's incredibly subtle, hiding the important bit in the everyday chatter. What was the specific lie in that letter?
Nye wrote that based on recent intelligence about German reinforcements in Greece and Crete, the chief of the Imperial General Staff felt their current forces weren't sufficient for the intended assault there. He explicitly mentioned reinforcing the 5th and 56th Divisions for attacks on Cape Araxos and Kalamata in Greece, and then referred to Sicily and the Dodecanese Islands merely as cover targets, a feint.
So they weren't just planting a fake target. They were giving the Germans a reason, based on their own supposed actions, reinforcing Greece, why Greece was now the primary target. That's smart.
Exactly. It played directly into what they thought German intelligence wanted to hear or would find plausible, given their own troop movements. There was another letter, too, a slightly shorter introduction from Vice Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten to Admiral Andrew Cunningham, presenting Martin as an amphibious warfare expert on loan.
Wasn't there a really cheesy pun in that one? I remember reading about that.
Yes. Apparently, Mountbatten insisted on including a deliberately clumsy joke about sardines, hoping the Germans would spot it and think it was some kind of subtle coded reference to Sardinia being another target.
I love that they included a strategic dad joke. It's just peak British eccentricity mixed with high-stakes deception.
Yeah.
And the briefcase itself was justified by him carrying, what, proof copies of some pamphlet?
Right. Proof copies of a combined operations pamphlet. It gave him a perfectly legitimate reason to be carrying sensitive documents with him relevant to amphibious operations. Plausible deniability.
Okay, and how did they plan to know for sure if the Germans had actually read these crucial letters without breaking the wax seals? That seems like a massive problem. If they couldn't tell, the whole thing might be pointless.
This was another stroke of simple genius. Inside the fold of the crucial Nye letter, they placed a single black eyelash. Very carefully.
An eyelash.
An eyelash. If the letter was open and refolded, even meticulously, the eyelash would almost certainly be dislodged or gone.
The eyelash. The ultimate low-tech, high-impact security measure. Brilliant. Okay, the plan is ready. Details are perfect. How do you get Major Martin and this briefcase from a cold room in London to where he needs to be found, off the coast of Spain?
This stage was just as meticulously planned as the preparation. They needed a very specific drop-off point. They chose Huelva on the southern coast of Spain.
Why Huelva specifically? Was it just about the tides carrying him ashore?
Tides and currents were definitely a factor. The hydrographer of the Navy advised it was likely a body released there would wash ashore. But critically, Huelva had a highly effective German Abwehr agent, Adolf Claus, operating there. Claus had excellent connections among the Spanish authorities. They needed the bait to be picked up by the right people who would absolutely pass it on to the Germans.
So they deliberately targeted a spot with a known active German spy. That's incredibly gutsy.
It was calculated risk. And they also had a reliable British vice-consul in Huelva, Francis Hazelden, who was brought into the plan and would manage the situation from the British side once the body inevitably turned up.
And they transported the Betty by submarine. That must have been incredibly difficult logistically.
It was seen as less risky than trying to simulate, say, a plane crash near the coast, or using a surface vessel which might be spotted. A submarine could get close to shore very discreetly. HMS Seraph, commanded by Lieutenant Bill Jewell, was chosen. It had experience with special operations missions. To the regular crew, the large, heavy canister being loaded was simply explained away as a top-secret meteorological device.
A meteorological device, of course, because that makes perfect sense for a clandestine submarine mission in wartime.
Right, exactly. The body went into this special canister labeled "Handle with Care," optical instruments. Just to further the cover story, it was packed with, I think, 21 pounds of dry ice to keep it cold and displace oxygen with CO2 for preservation during the journey.
And I have to ask about the frozen feet detail again, because that sounds like a practical nightmare right before the mission launch.
It was. Apparently a last-minute hitch just before they loaded the canister onto the sub. Glyndŵr and Michael's feet had become frozen rigid and they just couldn't get the uniform boots on. They had to quickly find an electric heater and carefully defrost his feet, just enough to get the boots on. It's one of those bizarre, almost darkly comedic details that just shows how much could have gone wrong at any moment.
It really does. So canister finally loaded into the van, driven by, of all people, the racing champion St. John Jock Horsefall. Another one of those strange, almost random details, up to Scotland and onto the submarine.
Correct. Seraph then sailed to a position about a mile off the coast of Huelva. In the pre-dawn hours of April 30th, 1943, they surfaced quietly. The officers brought the canister onto the deck, opened it, and gently released the body into the water.
Was there any moment of ceremony? Or just push him overboard?
No, there was. Apparently, Elton and Joel read Psalm 39 as they used the submarine's wake to help nudge the body towards the shore. A brief moment of respect. They then made sure the canister sank without a trace and submerged.
Mincemeat completed. That was the signal sent back to London, wasn't it?
It was. The bait was now cast. The most nerve-wracking part had begun.
Okay. The body is in the water off Huelva. Now comes the agonizing wait. Will the current take it to the right spot? Will the right person find it? Will the Germans actually believe this incredibly elaborate story?
You can only imagine the tension back in London. The waiting must have been excruciating, but the plan worked almost perfectly. Like clockwork, almost. The body was found by a Spanish fisherman the very next morning around 9:30 a.m., and then recovered by Spanish soldiers.
And the British vice consul, Hazelden, he knew exactly what to do because he was in on it.
Yes. He was officially informed and immediately notified London, playing his part. Then, a pre-scripted diplomatic drama began to unfold. Hazelden started sending these urgent-sounding cables back to the Admiralty about the discovery, emphasizing the importance of retrieving the briefcase found on the body. They knew the Germans were intercepting and reading these messages.
So they were essentially broadcasting, this stuff is super important.
Yeah.
In a way, the Germans would overhear and think they were getting a real inside scoop.
Exactly. Making the Germans think they were getting unauthorized access to something the British desperately wanted to keep secret. Double bluff. Hazelden was also present for the autopsy by the Spanish doctors. Knowing that Spanish doctors back then were often reluctant to perform detailed postmortems, especially in the heat, Hazelden subtly encouraged a quick examination. The doctors concluded the cause of death was simply asphyxiation through immersion in the sea, drowning, basically, which was exactly the outcome they needed. No tricky questions asked.
So Major William Martin was officially buried in Huelva with full military honors, a completely fake funeral for a real but unknown man. That's quite something.
A very bizarre scene, yes. But the critical element, of course, was the briefcase. The Spanish initially held on to it. And this is where the German agents, Claus and Kuhlenthal, went into overdrive. They applied huge pressure on their Spanish contacts. Even the head of the Abwehr, Admiral Canaris himself, got involved, demanding access to those documents.
And the Spanish authorities, under all this pressure, did they just hand them over eventually?
Not directly to the Germans in Huelva, it seems. The briefcase was moved inland. But yes, eventually, likely through a combination of that pressure and, let's face it, pro-German sympathies within parts of the Spanish regime, the Germans, or their trusted proxies, got access. They got their hands on it and photographed the documents.
But how did they get the letters out of the sealed envelopes without breaking the wax and making it obvious to the British when they eventually got the briefcase back? That sounds incredibly difficult.
This is maybe the most ingenious high-wire act of the whole counterintelligence part of the operation from the Spanish-German side. They carefully extracted the still damp letters by winding them tightly around a thin probe, essentially pulling them out as a tight cylinder between the glued flap and the body of the envelope, without disturbing the wax seal on the back. Then they photographed them, apparently soaked the paper in salt water again for authenticity, let it sit for 24 hours, before carefully reinserting them and letting the envelope seals naturally restick as they dried.
Wow. That's incredibly skilled tradecraft on their part. It sounds almost impossible to detect. How did the British possibly know?
Almost impossible. But remember the eyelash.
The eyelash. Did it work? Was it gone?
When the briefcase was finally diplomatically returned to the British and sent back to London for examination, the forensic team immediately checked. And yes, the eyelash was missing from the fold of the Nye letter. Gone. Further analysis showed the paper fibers were damaged in a way consistent with being open, folded, and then rolled up tightly. And crucially, when the papers dried completely, they curled slightly, remembering that cylindrical shape they'd been forced into.
That must have been an incredible moment in London. Definitive proof they'd seen the crucial document.
Yes, confirmation came from forensic science, absolutely. But the ultimate confirmation, the moment they knew the Germans had truly swallowed it hook, line, and sinker, came from Bletchley Park. From the ultra decrypts. Intercepted German messages started explicitly discussing the Anglo-Saxon order found on the body off Huelva and, crucially, showed German forces reinforcing defenses in Greece and Sardinia. Hitler himself was convinced that was the real proof.
Which led to the famous telegram confirming success. Mincemeat swallowed rod, line, and sinker by the right people, and from the best information, they look like acting on it. What an understatement that must have felt like.
It was a massive triumph. Montague even went a step further just to solidify the deception later on, arranging for Major Martin's name to be included in the official casualty list published in the Times newspaper on June 4th. And by pure chance, the same day's paper also reported on Leslie Howard, the famous actor, being shot down by the Luftwaffe over the Bay of Biscay. It just added another layer of grim reality to the whole idea of important people being lost at sea.
All these little coincidences and meticulous details lining up. So, what was the actual payoff? How did this utterly bizarre operation affect the war on the ground?
Well, the immediate impact was precisely the troop shifts the Allies had hoped for. Convinced the main invasion was headed for the Balkans, Hitler diverted significant forces. We're talking tanks, experienced divisions like the 1st Panzer Division, pulled from France and elsewhere to reinforce Greece and Sardinia. So by the time the real invasion of Sicily began, German strength there was considerably weaker than it would otherwise have been.
And the actual invasion, Operation Husky, that launched in July 1943.
It faced fewer defenders, particularly in the crucial early stages, yes. And the impact was tangible, measurable. Allied casualties and ship losses during the Sicily landings were significantly lower than military planners had projected. We're potentially talking thousands of lives saved, numerous ships preserved, and partly because of that, the island fell much faster than anticipated.
Did it have wider ripple effects beyond just the Sicily campaign?
Oh, absolutely. The rapid success in Sicily was a major factor, one of the key factors in the collapse of Mussolini's fascist regime in Italy shortly thereafter. That was huge, and even more significantly, perhaps, because Hitler remained convinced that the Balkans were the main Allied target, even after Sicily was invaded. He delayed and eventually suspended the crucial German offensive against the Soviets at Kursk in late July. He wanted troops available for a potential counter-invasion in the south, in the Balkans. That decision at Kursk was arguably the last real chance for the Germans to regain the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. Once that offensive failed, the tide permanently turned against them there.
So a dead man, a briefcase full of lies, and a missing eyelash helped change the course of two major campaigns and perhaps the entire war. It still feels absolutely unbelievable when you lay it out like that.
Look, there's always historical debate about assigning precise weight to any single operation versus other factors. And Hitler did have existing biases towards the Balkans, that's true. But mincemeat is widely acknowledged by historians as a major contributor to the strategic misdirection that profoundly aided the Sicily invasion and had significant, traceable knock-on effects. It's very hard to argue it wasn't hugely successful.
The legacy is huge, too, obviously. Ewan Montague wrote the famous book The Man Who Never Was, which became a classic film, cementing the story in popular culture.
Yes, though it's worth remembering Montague's book deliberately omitted certain key details, particularly anything about the ultra-decrypts, to maintain wartime secrecy that was still vital even years later. But yes, it cemented the legend of the operation in the public mind.
And what about Glenn Vermichael himself? The man, the real person at the center of it all. He wasn't just Major Martin.
No, he wasn't. For decades, Major William Martin was just that, a fictitious name on a grave in Huelva. It actually wasn't until 1996 that an amateur historian named Roger Morgan, through some really painstaking research, positively identified the body as Glenn Vermichael. And then in 1997, his real name was finally added to the gravestone in Huelva, acknowledging the crucial, albeit unwitting, role he played in this extraordinary event. There's also a more recent memorial plaque at the Hackney Mortuary in London, where his body was kept.
A final, fitting recognition for the individual whose tragic life enabled such an extraordinary deception.
It truly was an astonishing operation, wasn't it? It highlights how success in conflict isn't always just about brute force or numbers. Sometimes it's about deep psychological insight, meticulous attention to the smallest human details you know, the bank overdraft, the love letters, even the silly joke about sardines, all combined with brilliant intelligence gathering like the Ultra Intercepts. They didn't just fake a story, they crafted a life that felt real, knowing exactly how the enemy would likely process it.
It really makes you think about the power of narrative and belief, doesn't it? Even in the hard realities of intelligence and warfare. This plan worked because they understood human behavior, enemy assumptions, and the psychology of verifying information. So, thinking about that. Given the success of such audacious psychological tactics in history, how might similar, perhaps less visible deceptions be shaping events in the world today? What does this incredible story tell us about the enduring power of a convincing narrative, even when it's built ultimately on a foundation of lies?